Hello everyone and welcome to the second episode of Cricket Conversations. Today I have with me Paul Dennett, who is a renowned Australian cricket podcaster, and I think most of you know him pretty well, I suppose, on Twitter, and he's not shy from voicing strong opinions. Being an Australian fan myself, I've been trying to get in touch with Paul for quite some time now, but we obviously couldn't quite coordinate the timings due to the difference in time zone and work issues and all that. But here we are finally, and it's great to have you on board, Paul. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ankit. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So the agenda today is obviously discussing and celebrating to a certain extent Australia's win in the Ashes over arch rivals England. Australia wrapped up the series 3-0 at the Wacker Cricket Ground in Perth on the 18th of December, and after that there was a test, the prestigious Boxing Day test at the iconic Melbourne Cricket Ground, which ended in a rather dull draw, so to speak, and the pitch obviously at that stadium has been the subject of much heated debates and criticism over the last few days, and the ICC announced yesterday that the pitch has indeed been rated as poor due to the lack of contest between bat and ball, and the pitch not offering enough assistance for the bowlers to make any kind of inroads, or of not allowing the batsmen to play their shots. This is not the first time that the pitch at the MCG has produced a flat wicket. The last four test matches at the MCG have generally been quite high scoring ones, but this is the first time that a pitch in Australia has been rated as poor by the ICC, and you'd have to think that this is a rather embarrassing moment in the history of the great stadium, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm pleased that the ICC has rated it poor, because that's what it was. It deserved to be rated as poor, and I don't think that even the Melbourne Cricket Ground itself would deny that. It's a difficult ground because if you're not from Australia, you might not realise that although it's called the Melbourne Cricket Ground, its primary function is an Australian rules football ground. Throughout the entire autumn, winter and into the spring, it hosts usually about 2 or 3 games of Australian rules football each weekend, which regularly draw crowds of 60, 70, 80,000 or more. It is a massive sport in Victoria. It is the principal sport of Melbourne. And so eventually, given that they were what was making all the money for the MCG, I think they grew tired of the fact that during the winter months, the remnants of the cricket pitch meant that the centre ground of the football ground was very much a mud heap and not all that good. So they said, well, let's use the technology. We'll get drop-in wickets. We get the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, the drop-in wicket standard just doesn't seem to be as is required, and that there's too often situations where it doesn't deteriorate enough. It doesn't have enough life to it to begin with, and so you get a situation where it's difficult for bowlers to get batsmen out, and it's also difficult for batsmen to score quickly, and you get the recipe for a disaster like we had in the last few days. I mean, they had 262,000 people turn up for a very poor advertisement for Test cricket. So, look, I think the good news is that they know that they've made a mistake, and something needs to change. And if the drop-in wickets are causing difficulty, they've got to throw a lot of money at it. I mean, surely we've got the science and the technology to do things better. Adelaide was a drop-in wicket this year, and it seemed to go okay. So hopefully it's a wake-up call to the Melbourne Cricket Ground to really improve the wicket for the future.
Indeed, and the thing is that with Melbourne Cricket Ground, the drop-in wickets there do seem to have completely different characteristics to the Adelaide venue, where we have seen some really high-quality test matches over the last 4 years. And in the same time frame, Melbourne has produced 2 draws, I believe. One was against India in 2014, and this venue, this latest test match against England. And even apart from that, the test match against Pakistan last year was almost certain to be a draw until Pakistan collapsed rather inexplicably in the last couple of sessions on day 5. So other than that, the only test that has produced a result over the last 4 years is the test against the rather low-ranked West Indies side. So this is definitely a recurring trend and not just a one-off, so definitely something to be worried about. And so what exactly do you think they can do to change the nature of the surface here? Because maybe they can just transport the Adelaide wicket over here, or maybe why exactly is there such a big difference between two drop-in wickets in the same country?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose the Adelaide wicket is different in that it is a pink ball wicket these days, and the 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 night sessions probably bring the bowlers into play a little bit more. Certainly, in the first couple of pink ball Test matches at Adelaide, they were very concerned that the pink ball would get scuffed up and turn grey and become a very poor spectacle. So they deliberately made the wicket a little bit greener, a little bit lusher, so that it would be less likely to scuff up, and the result was that the bowlers were brought into the game a lot more. So maybe they need to do something similar for Melbourne. It's funny, your suggestion that they take the Adelaide wicket to Melbourne is something I've actually been saying, that I think that the costs involved would be significant because it's not easy to transport a wicket. I mean, Melbourne and Adelaide are a long way apart. They're, 800 kilometres apart, but it certainly should be that maybe they prepare more than one set of wickets, and if one of the sets of wickets isn't producing good cricket, as this ground hasn't been this season, the Sheffield Shield games at Melbourne have been poor, it would be good to have a contingency. I'm not enough of an expert on wickets to know what they need to do. All I know is that cricket is flush with money in this country. It has very intelligent administrators who recognise what a debacle this MCG wicket was. So I'm hopeful that they will do whatever's required to ensure that in future years the bowler has a better chance, and batsmen have a better chance of playing free scoring innings in Melbourne.
All right, that's the pitch part done. But one thing that I think shouldn't be ignored or overlooked amidst all the talk about the pitch is the fact that Australian side uh, batted an out of character draw on the fourth and fifth days. I mean, batting out a draw is not something that you normally associate with Australian sides. They've generally had this gung-ho approach of trying to win at all costs. I remember Michael Clarke's declaration at the Oval in 2013 when he just I think it set a target of around 200 for England to chase in a couple of hours, which was quite ridiculous, to be very frank, because there's absolutely no way that he was going to bowl England out within that time. And now you see teams, especially under Steve Smith, Australia seem to have adopted a different kind of approach there. Uh, they're probably a bit more conservative, and that they don't want to lose at any cost, and um, they're willing to grind it out for a draw. We saw the first such instance at Ranchi this year on a turning pitch in India on day 5, where Peter Hanscom and Sean Marsh batted pretty much the entire day to secure what was a heroic draw for Australia. So, what do you have to say about the progress made by the Australian team in this department? Because they have been critical of perhaps being a little too aggressive and not quite respecting the conditions enough. So, do you think this team has made enough progress in that regard?
Yeah, I think it was very impressive what they did in Melbourne, and you're right that in the past, I think that what Australia would have done would have been to play their natural games. They probably would have had a few decent partnerships, but I think a collapse was always around the corner, and I think that it may well have been that England had a relatively easy run chase in the final innings and may have won that match. I like the idea that when Smith has decided, okay, that's it, we're shutting off any hope of winning here, let's just play out for a draw in the good old-fashioned way of being absolutely boring, doing only what's required to survive, and if that's boring, then so be it. And so I think it's a really good evolution of the side. Hopefully it doesn't happen too often, and hopefully it's not at the expense of being aggressive when the game is still there to be won. But ultimately, when realistically that's your only option left, then I think it's a good sign, and I think that Smith and Warner and Mitchell Marsh batted really well.
Indeed, and especially I think David Warner, because he's someone, especially in the past, especially playing away from home, he's someone who's tended to play his natural game and perhaps not quite respect the conditions. But I think he's a player who's made significant strides this year, especially in Bangladesh, where he scored 100 on a turning track in the fourth innings, nearly pulled off a difficult run chase, and then backed it up with 100 in the next test, and obviously this innings at the MCG. So I think we've seen David Warner evolve as a Test cricketer over the year or so. I just go back to the humiliating defeat at Hobart and think about the progress the team has made. They bounced back to win that Adelaide Test against South Africa. They blanked Pakistan 3-0 and gave India a real run for their money. I mean, they were probably one or two partnerships away from achieving the impossible, that is beating India in India. The series in Bangladesh, you could probably term it as a disappointment, given that they managed to only draw against a lowly Bangladesh side, but I think they managed to come back pretty strongly from the position that they were in early on in the first test. They managed to take it to the distance and then won the second test quite emphatically despite losing the toss. And obviously the Ashes win at home, which was, you could say, probably was on expected lines, but I think I'm quite impressed by the progress the team has made, especially in Asian conditions. So do you think this team is now well equipped to continuously challenge teams overseas? There is a tour of South Africa coming up. There is a tour of the UAE that is against the Pakistan side later this year, and obviously the big one in England in 2019. So do you think this team is now has the ability to adapt itself to all conditions and be a consistent force away from home?
I think that they potentially do, but I still think that it's very difficult away from home in this day and age where opposition countries do seem to produce wickets very much tailored to their own strengths. We saw in 2015, after it was 1-1 in the first two test matches, England really prepared some green tops and Australia struggled, and I think they'd continue to struggle under those conditions. I think the key is the preparation. I think the preparation that Australia had for the tour of India was the best preparation Australia's had for an away tour in some time. That in the very congested schedule that exists these days, they did as much as they could. They went to the UAE, where they've got the centre of excellence in Dubai, which, because of the climatic conditions in Dubai, where it doesn't really rain during that part of the year, the pitches can be tailor-made. And I believe they trained on rank turners, and they trained on some more gentle turners, and kind of gave themselves the full range of what they would expect in India. They went over as early as possible. There was a situation where the final T20 game against Sri Lanka occurred while the Australian Test side was already in India, which raises the question of whether that series against Sri Lanka should have been played. But it showed that they had the right intent in terms of preparation. I mean, the preparation for the Bangladesh tour was nowhere near as good for a variety of reasons. So I think they actually performed pretty well there, because I think Bangladesh at home are a very difficult side to beat, and I agree with you that they did well to come back and win that second test match. I think that if they go to when they go to Pakistan and when they go to England next, the next tour for India is not for a long time away. They will be the tests, and I think there's every chance that they could succeed. I think that in Pakistan or in the UAE, if Nathan Lyon continues his current form, then that's going to be important, because the last time Australia were in the UAE, Nathan Lyon performed fairly poorly, and so the spin of was it Yasir Shah and Zulfikar Barber was dominant, and Australia really didn't have much to answer that with. If Nathan Lyon is at the standard that he needs to be, then we'll at least have something to hit back with that we haven't had. And that's one of the reasons I think that Australia did well in India, that O'Keefe and Lyon kind of matched Ashwin and Jadeja roughly. And as a result, as you say, the series went down to the wire, a little bit of luck either way, and Australia probably could have won it. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what we do over the next year or two.
Yeah, so I think the big progress that Australia made in Asian conditions, more so than the bowling, I think, was with regards to the batting, because the batting had come a cropper in the three tests in Sri Lanka last year, and the addition of the likes of Matt Renshaw and Peter Hanscom made a huge difference. Matt Renshaw scoring that 50 on a ranked turner at Pune and backing it up with another one at Bangalore in the next test, kind of tapered off towards the latter half of the series, but I think he still had a very good series for a youngster. Peter Hanscom playing that heroic match-saving innings at Ranchi, and also played a very good innings in Bangladesh in some extremely unforgiving conditions where I think it was 40 degrees Celsius. So I think these two guys have been, along with Steve Smith and to a lesser extent David Warner, these guys have been the linchpins of the batting lineup in Asian conditions. So isn't it a little surprising that both these guys, the two newcomers, Renshaw and Hanscom, are out of favor right now after a couple of poor matches? I mean, Renshaw was dropped based on his Sheffield Shield form, even though his test match form had been all right. He was dropped based on his Shield form, and Hanscom was just given the couple of test matches and made way for Mitch Marsh. So do you think these guys will make their way back in for South Africa, especially given the question marks over Cameron Bancroft and Usman Khawaja?
No, I don't think they will be included for the South African tour. I could be wrong, but I think that as things stand, Hanscom is a little bit out of favour. His technique seemed to be unusual, and he seemed to struggle to get a run in the few test matches that he played against England. And also prior to that, he did have a relatively poor patch in red ball cricket. He went to England in county cricket, didn't do a whole lot there. So all things being said, I think they realised that it was time to give someone else a go. Renshaw was unlucky because he'd done a fairly good job, as had Hanscom at the top level, and then he started the Sheffield Shield season here very poorly, not getting many runs, but also being very laborious. He's typically quite a slow batsman, but he was going along at scoring 20 or 30 per 100 balls, and I think they just thought that the time was right to give someone else a go. It's a difficult one because these guys were picked, they did well, they're still quite young. You could make another argument to say, for the very reasons that you picked them in the first place, you should have given them more opportunity. And someone like Bancroft, although he'd had a good run in the Shield, his overall record is nothing absolutely special. So I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that Bancroft is the answer, but I'm also not sure whether Renshaw or Hanscom are the answers either. I think that it's typical of most Test sides that you have 2 or 3 really good players, and the rest of the side you're always trying to just find who are the solid ones that can back them up. I think that as time goes forward, maybe even Chris Lynn will get an opportunity in red ball cricket. He's got a pretty good record, and he's been injured so often that he hasn't really had a chance to push his claims. But I think as far as the South Africa tour goes at the moment, they're probably looking to keep the same top 6 as they've got.
It's interesting you say that Matt Renshaw was dropped due to his rather laborious stays at the crease, where, the guy that has replaced him, Cameron Bancroft, he's also been getting starts, but he's looked quite uncomfortable at the crease. He's been batting for like 80, 90 deliveries and just getting 20, 25 runs, scratching around a little bit, not quite looking entirely in control against an English attack that is decent, but perhaps not quite a world-beating attack in these conditions. So do you think he is the man who's got the ability to handle the likes of Steyn, Philander, Mokel and Rabada on South African pitches? Or maybe they can go back to Renshaw, who had a decent, I think, debut against the same attack on a green surface at Adelaide. Didn't score a lot of runs, but he looked fairly secure and saw off the new ball and made things easier for the middle order.
It's a good point. I suppose the Bancroft situation, his relative struggles against England have occurred subsequent to his selection, obviously. When he got picked, he just made a big double hundred in the Sheffield Shield, and he looked a lot more fluent than Renshaw. I don't think I would have picked him because his overall record, I think he's got a first-class average touching in the high 30s or something like that.
37.
Yeah, and he's young enough that my attitude is always, if someone is in their late 20s and they're only averaging in the high 30s in first-class cricket, I think it's unreasonable to pick them because I don't think that you can expect them to do much better than that at the Test level. If someone's still a little bit younger, as Bancroft is, then potentially their talent hasn't matured yet, and they maybe can at the top level really kick on. I think that Steve Waugh and Michael Clarke are probably examples of that, where they didn't average so well when they were young players, but they had something about them. I think that the selectors have hoped that Bancroft has something about him. I think Greg Chappell, as one of the selectors, is always very much in the lines of finding these youngsters whose talent belies their record. Whether that's the case with Bancroft or not, look, I hope I'm proven wrong. I suspect it probably isn't, and I don't think he's necessarily a long-term Test player. But I've been proven wrong in the past. I might be proven wrong again. My gut feeling is that probably Bancroft and Renshaw and maybe even Hanscom, all 3 of them, may not be the answer. And long-term, whether they'll be in the side in 2 or 3 years' time, I've got serious doubts about.
So, I mean, if you had to pick an opener for the South Africa tour to partner David Warner, who would you pick?
Well, it's a good question. I do want to give Lynn a chance at the top level, and people would say, well, he's too aggressive, and do you really want to open up with 2 highly aggressive players like Warner and Lynn? And my answer to that is, why not? Lynn's got an average of about 43, 44 at first class level. That's pretty much better than almost all of them, except for Hilton Cartwright, and he's another one that I would consider. But I think as things stand, Bancroft will get the job because you've got to give someone a decent hit out at the top level. He has done some good things playing for Australia. So I think that if you're going to cull someone so quickly, then that's probably the wrong thing. So I think inevitably he'll be in the side.
fair enough. And there are also question marks over Usman Khawaja. There's, especially in the commentary box, the likes of Kevin Peterson and Shane Warne have been particularly critical of his approach at the crease. They feel that he's not quite busy enough and just goes into the shell and allows the bowlers to bowl at him the way they want. And he's obviously been a rather controversial and polarizing figure in Australian cricket over the last couple of years because he's struggled immensely in Asian conditions, and which is why he's seen as more of a horses for courses pick. And despite his great performances at home last summer, he was dropped for the India tour, was picked again in Bangladesh, dropped after one test. So there's been some chopping and changing going on there, and that's, you could perhaps argue quite reasonably that that has perhaps dented his confidence a little bit. So he's had a torrid time. Well, not quite torrid, but he's struggled in the series against England. Even though he scored a couple of 50s, he hasn't quite looked at his fluent best the way he did last summer or the one before that. So what do you think is going on wrong with Usman Khawaja? And do you think that he is the long-term answer, or maybe if issues continue to persist, then he might well be culled, because he's already seen as an option that cannot be picked in subcontinental conditions. So he can ill afford to fail elsewhere, because they've already been ruled him out of four countries, and if he starts failing at home as well, then you probably have to think that they have to move on from him.
Yeah, he's under pressure, but I still think they should give him a little bit more time. He's got an average of 43 in Test cricket. That's pretty good, and his last, not this summer, but the 2 or 3 summers before that at home, he has looked in sensational form. He had a very poor tour of Sri Lanka, and he got dropped, but a lot of Australians had a poor tour of Sri Lanka. He's probably been harshly treated a little bit by the selectors, so I think that they should now say, okay, there's a significant chance that he is someone who we want at Test level. Let's give him a little bit longer rather than a little bit shorter. Personally, I think he needs to be aggressive at the crease. Whenever he comes out and just looks to occupy the wicket, to occupy the crease, he just doesn't seem to be. That's not the way that he should be playing. And whenever he's come out with an intent to really look positive, I think then he started to look pretty good. I also haven't ruled him out as being a success in Asian conditions either. And I think that if you're good enough to play an average 43 in Test cricket, then there's no reason why you can't also become good enough to tackle the spin bowlers in Asia. That's something they need to really work on with him. The good thing from his point of view is that we haven't got actually that many Test matches in Asian conditions coming up in the short term. There's the series in Pakistan, but other than that, there's not another tour to India for a few years yet. So he should definitely be working on his ability to play spin in Asian conditions. But I think the main thing is to try to get him firmly ensconced in the side and have a big tour of England in 2019, or give him enough opportunities between now and then. And if he fails enough, then draw a line through him at that point. But I don't think that time has come yet.
Yeah, and he had a really great series against South Africa at home last summer, so that should probably keep him in the side for the South Africa tour at least, even if he fails at Sydney, you'd have to think. And Glenn Maxwell was on the fringes of the Test side at the start of the summer. I think he was called up as a potential backup for David Warner and Sean Marsh when they were thought to be suffering from injuries at the start of the first Test. Both of them did eventually make it, and since then Maxwell has just gone off the radar a little bit. He scored a double 100 in Sheffield Shield cricket, and I think backed it up with another score of 90 odd. But since then he's been playing at the Big Bash. He hasn't scored a lot of runs there, and in the ODI squad that was announced today, he seems to have been left out of that. So what exactly has gone wrong for Glenn Maxwell from being in the fringes of the Test side after scoring a Test 100 in India, having a pretty decent tour of Bangladesh? He now seems to be out of favor in one of his favorite formats. So what exactly is going on there?
Well, I think that they are continually a little bit frustrated by him, and that Steve Smith has said in the press today that his attitude at training needs to change. He needs to train a little bit more professionally, I think it was. And look, I find him a very frustrating player, because I think that he has it within him to be one of the best cricketers in the world in all formats. And yet, if I was an opposition fan and when he came out to bat, I would feel that, well, we're every chance of getting him out cheaply, because he's almost so outrageously talented that he doesn't allow himself to play himself in and and be a little bit boring from time to time. Ironically, last night he was that. He played pretty well last night. He got a 50 in the Big Bash as his side was really struggling around him. And, he still got the 50 off 39 balls, which was the top score for the Melbourne Stars. He needs to play like that more often. When things are difficult, he just too often takes the option of, I'll try and clear long on with a 6, and I've been caught at long on, so be it. I think that he should be someone who's good enough to be in the Australian Test side. I think he needs to take a leaf out of Steve Smith's book and say, when the conditions are right, by all means, give the bowling everything. But just as Smith has done this series in the Ashes, in Brisbane and in Melbourne, when conditions were not conducive to fast scoring, he scored very, very slowly. Then in Perth, when the conditions were conducive to scoring, he scored at a quick rate. I think Maxwell needs to do that. I think they're continually trying to send him a message saying, we want you in the side, but we need you to be as good as you can be, and you're not doing that yet.
So do you think his chances of being in the Test side for the tour of South Africa are in any way affected by his omission from the ODI side? Because his ODI performances in recent times haven't been up to the scratch. But his Test performance has actually been quite good. He had a really good tour of India, was the only batsman other than Steve Smith to average over 40 and score 100. And he did a decent job in the second Test in Bangladesh as well. Had a very good time in the Sheffield Shield. So his issues have ironically actually come in the shorter formats, for which he's supposed to be a bit of a specialist, whereas his performances in the longer format have been better. So do you think he'll be in the party to South Africa, especially given that there are question marks over quite a few of the players right now? You say that Hanscom is probably out of favor, Renshaw out of favor, question marks over Cameron Bancroft. So is there an opening for Glenn Maxwell to possibly be included, not necessarily in the playing 11, but at least in the touring party to South Africa?
Yeah, there is, and I think that he's probably a strong chance of being included. The difficulty you'll face is that they won't take all that many. There'll only be one, maybe two reserve batsmen, so he's going to be up against it there. I think he's, as you said, Hanscom is out of favour. He may not make the squad for South Africa. Cartwright may also be sort of under a little bit of pressure. So there's every chance they'll pick Maxwell. I think a lot will depend on the form that he shows during the rest of the Australian summer, as against the other players as well. I think he's still there and thereabouts, but there's a feeling, I believe, that he could be someone who regularly scores big at the Test level, and that he needs to show them more along those lines that he can do that. And at the same at the one-day level, that he's the sort of player that he needs to take more out of the leaf out of the books of Michael Bevan and others, and say, when the conditions aren't so good, it's okay to take a little bit of time and be a little bit boring. You don't have to hit every ball a reverse sweep for 6.
And also there are question marks over the backup fast bowling in the Australian side. Jimmy Anderson questioned Australia's pace reserves after the Test at Perth, when Mitchell Starc was ruled out of the Boxing Day Test, and Jackson Bird actually came into the Test match with a pretty decent record, but his performance there, you could say perhaps vindicated their comments. And even though it was a very flat surface, Jackson Bird looked a little innocuous and didn't quite threaten the batsman at all. So, looking ahead to the tour of South Africa, do you think he'll be in the mix, or maybe they could look at someone younger and someone with a bit more pace to back up the front three?
Yeah, it was a very disappointing outing from Bird at Melbourne. I'm a fan of Jackson Bird, so I was very sad to see him not do well in Melbourne. And I think you do have to give some excuses that a pitch that was rated poor by the ICC, even though he looked quite innocuous, most of the bowlers did struggle on that. And I think that you've got to give him another chance on better conditions. As you said, his record's pretty good. He's got a bowling average in the sort of mid-20 region in first-class cricket. It's probably a slightly better bowling average than most of the Australian bowlers. He's tall, he's pretty accurate, he moves the ball a little bit. He's the kind of bowler that I like. And yeah, he doesn't have the outright speed that others do. I always think that outright speed is a little bit overrated. Obviously, he'd rather a bowler bowling at 145 than 135, but not if they have to sacrifice accuracy in order to do so. And I think that in a first-choice team at the moment, obviously Starc, Hazelwood and Cummins are those three. Whether Bird gets chosen for the tour of South Africa, I think he's still a chance of playing in the Sydney Test match if Starc is not fit, and if they decide that they don't. Has it been? Oh, I haven't heard.
Yeah,
Tell
the
me.
11 has already been announced. Stark is back for Bird, and Ashton Agar is not playing, despite him being announced in the squad. The pitch is perhaps not quite as spin-friendly as they were expecting, so they're just going in with the combination that played at Perth, I guess.
Oh, right, okay, there you go. I didn't know that the Sydney 11 had actually been announced. That's good to hear that Mitchell Stark is back, but it is disappointing. Um, that may be the last chance Jackson Bird gets at Test level, and I'd feel sorry for him if that were the case, because I think his record in Test cricket up till now has been pretty good, and it would be like picking a batsman on the greenest of green tops, and when they get two ducks saying, well, we're never going to pick them again. I think you do need to give him a chance, but obviously if Stark's ready to come back, then you're going to pick him. As for whether he gets on the tour of South Africa, the Melbourne Test match won't help him, but I still think they would hold him in high regard. He'd still be a chance. James Pattinson and Jason Berendorf would be, and Chad Sayers would be the other competitors. The first of those two have been afflicted with injuries for much of the season. So, I'd say Bird's probably a 50-50 chance of going to South Africa.
I think I expect probably a couple of fast bowling backups in the tour of South Africa. So, for the Ashes, apart from the front three, the two backups were Jackson Bird and Chad Sayers. And both of them are very similar bowlers in the sense that they both are, you can say, in the medium pace range, don't quite have the express pace. So on the pitches, on South African pitches, maybe they might just want someone with an extra yard of pace. I think Chad Sayers was picked specifically with an eye on the Adelaide Test due to his local expertise and his ability to bowl with the pink ball. But on more traditional Test match wickets in South Africa, I think they might not want both of them. Of bowlers of similar type in the squad, so there might be an opening for some young fast bowler, maybe someone like Jai Richardson, who is in the ODI side, to make his way into the Test squad for South Africa, because he is someone who offers that extra bit of pace. And if Stark, Hazelwood or Cummins goes down injured, then you probably want to replace them with someone who can provide an equivalent speed. So maybe is he a contender for the tour of South Africa?
Anything's possible. He's got a very abbreviated first-class record. He's only played about 4 or 5 first-class games, but he's done well in those games. And the Australian selectors are always, they're likely to do anything. So I wouldn't have thought that he'd be picked for South Africa. I wouldn't have thought that he'd come into contention for South Africa. But it wouldn't surprise me, by the same token, if he did, that they're liable to do anything. And I wouldn't mind either. He does look like a very decent bowler. He's very young. I think he's got a lot of potential. And I'd just say, in terms of speed, that it is good to have the speed. But you look at South Africa, and Vernon Philander has just about the best record of all of the South African bowlers, and he's someone that is about that Jackson Bird, Chad Sayers pace, and he's done very, very well in South Africa. So you always go back to Glenn McGrath, someone who didn't have the speed but had the accuracy and had the movement, and compare him to, say, Brett Lee, who had all the speed and yet ended up with a bowling average in Test cricket in the low 30s. Still a very good bowler, but I sometimes think speed is a little bit overrated.
Yeah, and the other major talking point in the ODI squad, apart from the omission of Glenn Maxwell, is the guy who was picked in place of him, Chris Lynn, who's just coming back from an injury. I think I watched a little bit of his BBL match the other day, and he seemed to be struggling a little bit in the field. Wasn't quite throwing with the same freedom that he used to in the past. Looked a little bit, compromised with the bat as well. And I think he's only played two matches in the Big Bash since his return, and he's been thrown in straight into the ODI side, because I don't think he's played anything longer than T20 for the last 2 or 3 years. So is it a big risk to pick someone whose fitness is still very much in doubt for an ODI match, the length of which he hasn't experienced for quite some time now?
Well, I think the main issue with him is that he has injured his shoulder, I think it's 4 times now in as many years, and I just think he needs to accept that he, in the field, can't throw himself around, and that he's a very competitive player. He likes to be able to throw himself horizontal and take catches and give 100%, and I think he needs to get it through his head that he's just got to accept that he can't do that anymore, because another injury to his shoulder, he may never play again. I think it's good that he's been picked in the side. I mean, the attitude to one-day cricket in Australia is that if it's not the World Cup, it doesn't really matter anyway. Australia could win this series against England 5-0 or lose it against England 5-0. In a year's time, no one's going to remember. So you might as well, be a little bit creative with your selections. And the biggest problem is that the robbing the Big Bash of Chris Lynn takes a little bit of the lustre away of the Big Bash, and it ties into a debate that Australia is having a little bit now, that the one-dayers in January have lost so much of their prestige, and that it almost seems as though Lynn would be better off playing in the Big Bash because that's a more important form of cricket.
Okay, that's an interesting point. But since you mentioned Big Bash, I mean, I just wanted to bring this up because, I mean, I'm not a big fan of T20 cricket, and the Big Bash obviously is one of the most glamorous T20 leagues in the world. But I think, just speaking as a test match purist and looking ahead to the tour of South Africa or even the tour of India last year, or any winter tour for that matter, and when I look at the schedule of Big Bash, and it generally occupies 2 months in December and January when Australia are playing test match cricket, and some of the fringe players, the likes of Renshaw, for example, or Hanscom, or maybe someone like Shad Sayers or Jackson Bird, who are perhaps not quite great T20 players. Is it a little bit unfair on them that they don't have any Sheffield Shield cricket to press their claims for a spot in the Test side? I remember Steve O'Keefe being pulled out of the Big Bash last year to play in some great cricket in Sydney to prepare him for the tour of India. So do you think that that's something that they need to do more often, because the Big Bash is seriously compromising the amount of first-class cricket that the players can play during the season to press a claim for the February-March tours? So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's true. It is hard for the players that aren't in the Test side and aren't really Big Bash type players, that they are starved of first-class cricket. Some of them play second 11 cricket, as you said. It was Steve O'Keefe's decision last year to pull out of the Big Bash because he wanted to focus on bowling lots of overs in grade cricket, which worked. So I think it is an issue, but I think as a Test match purist, ironically, you should embrace the Big Bash, because I think it's the best thing to happen to Test cricket in Australia in a long, long time. That the Cricket Australia have been very keen to set the Big Bash up as something to attract young people to the sport. And whereas the IPL, which is very, very successful, is privately run by individual franchises, and they're looking to make a profit, and there's nothing wrong with that. The Big Bash is all about let's get cricket popular. And so you've got, I've said this before in other forums, that I've been to games of Big Bash cricket, and I've been amazed at what wonderful demographics there are. There are families and young people and people that you would never have thought would be interested in cricket turning up. That is a massive win for cricket in this country, and ultimately Test cricket, because the day that Chris Lynn makes his Test debut, there will be hundreds of thousands of young kids in Australia who know of him through the Big Bash, who will be more likely to watch Test cricket as a result. There are people who would never have had any interest in cricket at all, who are now half interested in it because of the Big Bash. They may never go on to be great Test match fans, but they were never going to be in the first place. It's got people involved in cricket who never would have been. It's fun, it's fast, it's relaxed, it's a nice entry into cricket. In the past, the first time you ever experienced cricket, you know, if you weren't young, if you were coming to it from an older age, you'd look at it and think, why is this sport being played? If you'd just seen the Melbourne Test match as the first time experience to cricket as compared to a Big Bash game, then the difference is going to be absolutely chalk and cheese. I went with a Scottish friend a couple of years ago to a T20 game, and he had no interest in cricket, actually hated cricket because it was associated as a sort of an English sport rather than a Scottish sport. He had 2.5 hours at the T20 game and loved it, and walked away saying, I can see why cricket has got something to it. So the Big Bash is not everyone's cup of tea. It's very much marketed towards the young people, and it's doing its job. And so I think that there'll be a whole generation of young people who will be interested in cricket who otherwise wouldn't have been if the Big Bash wasn't there.
But do you think that it would be better off if they just play the Big Bash maybe on weekends and spread out over a longer period, rather than having a concentrated 2-month period, depriving the first-class cricketers of cricket altogether for 2 months? Because now that you see, the first-class season is basically it is 2 different seasons, because you have the first half of the season, then you have a 2-month break, and I mean the second half of the season you generally feel that the teams tend to lose momentum or form, and there's basically no connection between the two. So I mean, it's just become, the first class season has just been divided into 2 entirely different seasons. Do you think that maybe they could just look at having the Big Bash, maybe just spread it out over a longer duration, but keep the Sheffield Shield going and not have a complete break for 2 months and maybe play the Big Bash more on weekends or maybe something like that?
Oh, look, I think if you raise that with Cricket Australia, they would say, in an ideal world, yes, we'd love to do that, and that's what they would do. But in reality, it just can't happen that way. Australia has a period where the schools break up in late December. Schools go back at the start of February. There's a 6 to 8 week period where cricket is absolutely king, and the Big Bash has to be on during that period. As soon as you get into mid to late February, then the country's appetite for sport changes. And in half the country, they're ready for the Australian rules football season. In the other half, they're ready for the rugby league football season. The newspapers cover nothing else, and cricket quickly recedes into the background. So if you had the Big Bash just at weekends so that you could have the Sheffield Shield going on, once you got the Big Bash into late February, people would stop watching it. And it would just lose the golden little period that it's got now, where it just is a short, sharp, condensed, successful tournament that is then a very attractive proposition for broadcasters and all these other things. So unfortunately, that's the reality.
All right then. That's a wrap from us over here, and it was great chatting to you, Paul, and hopefully we'll have your company very soon.
Thanks, Sanket. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah. So that's it from us, and do keep watching cricket. The Sydney Test starts from tomorrow, and there's also the India's tour of South Africa starting on Friday, I believe. So there's some really exciting Test cricket lined up. The Big Bash is also going on, so keep watching cricket and keep tuning into the channel, because we're going to bring some really interesting episodes very soon. Thank you. Thanks for listening. And do share your feedback.